Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is Computer Security Introduction. So I want to start off by talking about some stories about some security problems. And I'll admit these are a little bit scary. We will be talking about how to protect your computer in a couple lectures, so you can keep that in mind when you're listening to these stories. All right, so our first story has to do with the Dalai Lama and a attack using a network called the GhostNet. In 2009, the Dalai Lama's computers were infected, and a program called the Ghost Rat, where RAT stands for Remote Access Tools, was installed on the computers in his offices. The RAT tools gave remote access, including access to files on the computer, being able to transfer them off the computer to elsewhere on the internet. It gave complete control over the microphones and cameras. And ultimately, Ghost Rat ended up infecting over 1,200 computers in over 100 countries. Most of the computers were in foreign affairs ministries, embassies, and non-governmental organizations. The attack vector that was used to install these programs on the Dalai Lama's computers was an email from an email address marked campaign@freetibet.org. There was a Word document attached to the email entitled Translation of Freedom of Movement for Tibetans in Exile.doc. While we don't have 100% certainty who attacked the Dalai Lama's computers, a one-year investigation by Canadian security experts tracked where the Ghost Rat was sending information back to Hainan Island in China, which is the home of Chinese Signals Intelligence Unit. So it's likely, given who might want to hack the Dalai Lama and given what they were able to discover about how the tools work, it was probably China. All right, here's another story. In 2010, the FBI monitoring software detected anomalies from the NASDAQ stock exchange computers. When they went in, they discovered that there was software installed on the computers that included destructive code. They weren't able to 100% discern what the destructive code was supposed to do, but it included two day zero exploits. And this is a subject that's going to come up in a bunch of other places. A day zero exploit is an exploit that nobody has seen before. So this is something that somebody has found is a vulnerability in existing software, and nobody knows about it. So if you have a day zero exploit, generally that's considered a pretty huge deal, and you're going to want to keep that in your back pocket. Only use it when you really, really need to, because basically it's kind of like the coronavirus, where there's a whole wide field out there and nobody has any defenses against it. So to give you an example of the opposite of that, we'll be talking in more detail about this particular example later in this lecture series, but there was a ransomware attack that happened a couple years ago that, among other things, took out the British National Health computers. That was not a day zero exploit. If anybody had updated their Windows computers, they were not vulnerable to that virus. So this was a known issue. Again, not a day zero exploit. A day zero exploit is something where nobody's seen it before, and it's pretty much guaranteed to work on any computer that you use it on. So in this particular case, there were two day zero exploits used in order to get to the NASDAQ computers. The signature on the software that was used to attack NASDAQ matched Russian FSB. Russian FSB is a successor to the KGB, and well, it's half of the successor to the KGB. There's another successor agency as well, and it's basically roughly equivalent to the US FBI. You can hear Maddie in the background. She really wants me to play with her. So it's likely that this came from the FSB, but it's also possible that somebody stole the code from the FSB. It also turns out that, for example, code that the NSA uses to attack computers at one point was stolen or was misplaced and ended up out on the internet. So it's possible that this wasn't the FSB using their code. It's possible somebody else was using their code. Ultimately, we don't know who attacked the NASDAQ. Some people point the finger at China, but it's most likely Russia. At around the time the hack occurred, Russia was working on the Russian stock exchange, so it's possible that the people hacking the NASDAQ were actually looking for techniques and the internal workings of the computers to use for the Russian stock exchange. However, in addition to the original attack, the FBI found other pieces of software also installed on NASDAQ. This is kind of scary. They found signs of various groups operating on the NASDAQ computers, including criminal hackers and Chinese cyber spies. They also discovered that the One Liberty Plaza building management, that's where the NASDAQ is located, their website had been infested with a black hole exploit kit, which basically anybody who visited their website, if they were trying to pay their bills or doing other maintenance, they would get infected. In May 5, 2000, an email entitled "I Love You" was sent out, and it included a virus, and it was designed as a worm to distribute itself across the internet. Ultimately, 45 million computers were infected. It used a Visual Basic script file, which copied itself to other Visual Basic script files. It sent out copies of itself to everyone in the Outlook email address book. So if you were using Outlook, it would look through your email addresses and it would just basically create duplicate copies of the mail message, and that would infect everybody in your mail book. It overwrote multimedia files, including JPEGs. It sent copies of itself to people in chat rooms, and it contacted 4 websites in the Philippines. The perpetrators were identified, but at the time, no computer crime laws existed in the Philippines, so they were ultimately not charged. In 2016, John Podesta, who was chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, received an email claiming to be a Google security alert. He clicked on the link and entered his password information. And of course, it wasn't Google. And WikiLeaks published over 20,000 pages of Clinton campaign emails by getting in through his original email access. Security experts believe the hack was done by a hacking group called Fancy Bear, which is associated with the Russian intelligence services. Stuxnet is a program that was designed to attack Siemens equipment. Ultimately, the target was believed to be Iran's nuclear program, which was using Siemens equipment. And in particular, it was going after their centrifuges. It was basically throwing off the timing on the centrifuges, and it was designed to destroy the centrifuges being used to refine uranium. Stuxnet was designed to spread itself through a network. It replicated itself through Windows computers and looked for Siemens Windows-based software where it attacked programmable logic controllers. It included 4 day zero exploits. Remember, we talked about day zero exploits, which led everybody to believe that it was being put out by a nation state's national security apparatus. There was a vulnerability used to spread across USB sticks. This is believed to be necessary because the Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities were probably not on the internet. So somehow you would have to get the virus into their internal network. And so this is likely done through a USB drive, possibly by actually having an agent there in place. We'll talk about some other methods in the next lecture in terms of how you might get somebody to stick a USB drive onto their computer. It turns out it's not very hard. It used a vulnerability in print spoolers to spread across networks using shared printers. And it used 2 different vulnerabilities to gain proper privileged access once it got on a particular computer. All right, so we're going to have 3 different lectures on security. The rest of today's lecture is going to focus on mechanisms for security, different ways that computer scientists protect your computers. The next lecture is going to focus on different ways your computer can get attacked. And then the third lecture will focus on how to defend your computer from attacks. For today's lecture, I want to focus on 4 different security concerns: confidentiality, authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. Confidentiality has to do with when I'm talking to somebody else, how do I know that somebody else isn't listening in? So I'm going to use, for most of these examples, I'm going to use Alice, Bob, and Mallory. These are traditional names used by security researchers. So if your name's Mallory, I'm sorry, it's not my fault. And there's actually over 20 different names of different people in different roles, but I'm just going to use Alice and Bob, who are just our 2 people that are trying to communicate over the internet, and then Mallory is the attacker. There's all sorts of different variants where like Eve is there to eavesdrop, Mallory is there to do malicious things. And as I said, there's over 20 different names, but we're just going to use Alice, Bob, and Mallory for most of the examples. Okay, so Alice is sending a message to Bob. She says, hey, do you want to meet for lunch? And confidentiality means that only Alice and Bob can read that message. If a third party like Mallory is able to read it, that means we don't have confidentiality. Authentication means that the person we're communicating with actually is who they say they are. So in this case, Alice is communicating over the internet, and she thinks she's talking to Bob, but how do we know she's talking to Bob? Maybe she's talking to Mallory. And so authentication is, how can Bob prove that Bob really is Bob? How can Alice be sure that that's Bob over there and not Mallory? Okay, integrity has to do with, can somebody manipulate the message? So you might be able to manipulate the message or corrupt the message without actually being able to read the message. So this is interrelated with confidentiality and authentication, but there's different variants here in terms of what a malicious person could do that don't necessarily violate confidentiality or don't necessarily violate authentication. All right, so Alice sent this message, meet for lunch, to Bob. And maybe Mallory's not able to actually change the message, but he's able to add on to the message. So he says, meet for lunch at Coho. And Bob goes to Coho, and Alice is somewhere else and doesn't know why Bob didn't show up. Another possibility is Mallory might be able to actually see the message being sent, grab the message, and then send the same message at a later point in time. And Bob might not realize that he's actually seeing a message that's been seen previously. So, if the system's not set up properly, he'll know that it was sent from Alice because maybe there's some security credentials on it. But if Mallory is able to grab the whole thing, including the security credentials, and just resend at a later date, Bob's going to think he's supposed to meet for lunch, and Alice won't be there because this is actually a repeat from a message that was sent a couple days ago. All right, non-repudiation. So suppose I send out an email that says there's no final exam, and usually this is the point in the quarter where I make a joke about, but there really is a final exam. So I'm not saying this is not a real example, but hey, turns out this quarter there is no final exam. So yay. All right, so suppose I send out an email that says no final exam, and you guys all get it, and then I claim I didn't send it out. Is there a way that you can prove I actually sent it? And so that's what non-repudiation has to do with. Okay, so this is just a quick reminder that this lecture was originally recorded last spring, and that in fact we do have a final this quarter, but it will be open book, open note, and it should be pretty easy for you. You will have plenty of time for it, very low pressure. All right, back to your pre-recorded lecture. All right, so in the next video, we're going to talk about different mechanisms that we use for computer security and how they might be used to address these 4 issues. I'll talk to you soon.